He was first elected to the United States Senate in 1992. That was the first of 3 terms. There were 3 terms in the United States Senate. And I could tell you a little bit about that election because I think it's going to be relevant to our discussion. Well, maybe I'll just wait for a moment, tell you a little more about Russ, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about 1992 and his first campaign. But he served 3 terms in the United States Senate since then. He has been an envoy to Africa. He has been the lead figure for the American Constitution Society through the first Trump term, very fraught time. And he is now the chairman of the board for the organization called Global Change. That is global climate change, of course. And that is taken him to an international level of service and contribution, and is also shows a little bit of his long time commitment to environmental issues. He was primarily known, of course, in the Senate as the lead figure, one of the lead figures for campaign finance reform, in an era when campaign finance reform was not only possible, but really a juggernaut of attention and people desiring to see the system cleaned up. Some of you have heard of McCain-Feingold, and you might have wondered if McCain was the first name and if McCain is the first name for Senator Feingold. But those were 2 senators. John McCain is no longer with us, but his legacy has been carried on by a number of other people, unfortunately not in power. And since the Citizens United decision in 2010, it has been extremely difficult for the bipartisan Campaign Reform Act to really be enforced or to have any real meaning, because that Supreme Court case was so devastating to the entire concept of campaign finance reform, or for that matter, the concept of trying to keep money under some control in our political system. So that's just a really, really quick background. I should mention that he was in the Wisconsin State Senate for 10 years before he came here to Washington. He was a Madison guy, I think, right from the very beginning. Were you not? Oh, I'm sorry, but you were Madison in school, University of Wisconsin at Madison. So you are a Badger, but he is from Janesville originally, and that is a famously political city in southern Wisconsin, has produced a lot of great politicians. And then after UW-Madison, he went on to a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, and then to Harvard Law School, and then into politics, state Senate, as I said, for 10 years before he was elected to the United States Senate. I have to say this, when going back to that year when you were first elected in 1992, he started out with very low name recognition. I think it was in single digits. I really do. And it was crazy because there were 2 much better known Democrats running for the nomination in 1992. There was a sitting congressman from Milwaukee, big voting base, and there was also the richest Democrat in the state, except maybe for Herb Kohl, and he was former chairman of the party, and everybody knew him. And the contest was assumed to be between those 2 heavyweights, and Russ came along and ran what I would describe as a populist campaign. You know, I'm going to ask you to agree or disagree with that. Good with that. Yeah, there were quirky ads, wonderful ads, the ads you made outside the homes of your opponents. There was a Elvis impersonator in there, I do believe. It was wonderful stuff. It was Elvis. Oh, was it? I'm sorry, I forgot. I forgot that Elvis actually did endorse you, but that was what I would call an early populist campaign, and it started from nothing. And of course, it was underfinanced because you agreed not to take very much money from anybody other than Wisconsinites, and in the end. Correct me if I'm wrong, I just saw this figure again today, 70% of the vote in the primary, 7-0 after starting in single digits. Oh, there was a bit of a meltdown, and it's true, but that was a phenomenal campaign. And of course, you went on to win in the fall as well. And I'm going to want to come back to that because I'm going to want to ask you this question. If that was populism in 1992, and I think we could agree that that term would apply, what would we say about something like the Tea Party in 2010? And what would we say about, say, MAGA or where we are today? Would you call all of those movements populism?
All right. Well, I definitely want to talk about that. I guess best to take the microphone. Good afternoon, good evening. First of all, thank you, Ron. I want to thank the Thurbers for your sponsorship of this and your creation of this wonderful program here. And Ron was covering me, and we had interaction when I was in the state senate way back when. So I've always remembered he was one of the first people with any national reporter that I had any contact with. So thank you for inviting me to this. This is a great school. I've had the opportunity to teach in this building a few times, and I think it's just marvelous, both the facility and the quality of the instruction and the students, who I see many of you here tonight. Thank you for coming tonight. I want to acknowledge the anniversary of what happened 2 years ago before I go on, which is not our topic tonight, but one of the greatest horrors that any of us has ever experienced, as has been the horrible events that have occurred for the people of Gaza since, and the continuing suffering in Israel. So I can't go on without at least joining in the acknowledgement of that. But the reason we're talking about this tonight is that you contacted me and said that for some reason you saw some speech I gave down at the University of Virginia in 2018, where my good friend Larry Sabato invited me. And the thing I talked about there was populism and plutocracy. And the topic for tonight, although we're just going to have a conversation, but you suggested we're going to talk about populism, plutocracy, and the new age of reform. So the first thing I want to say is the events of the last couple of years, not certainly the events of the last 10 years, but especially the last couple of years, are so unbelievable to me. If anyone tells you they saw this all coming, they're liars. Nobody saw it coming. It's 100 times worse than anything I could have imagined. So that's my giant caveat for everything I'm saying. I'm grappling with it just like you are, trying to understand how this nation, with this Constitution, and with these people could come to this point. But the thing I want to say about populism is that right after the election in 2016, I was asked to speak at Oxford University, where I got my first law degree, about populism at the Blavatnik School, which is a great public policy school there. And it became apparent to me that populism was being put forward by the corporate sponsors and others of the event as a dirty word. So I was the only person in all the speakers, and there were wonderful speakers. I was the only person to say, wait a minute, populism is not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of like certain people in our society have claimed ownership of the flag. The flag is not theirs. They try to own the Constitution. The Constitution is not theirs. Populism should not just be theirs. And I would even add the name Robert F. Kennedy. I'm not giving that one up either. That's my hero. It's pretty painful to have Robert F. Kennedy's name basically dragged in the mud by his own son. So all of these things, there's a tendency here to let them take over. Well, what populism is here, and this is the speech that I gave in Virginia, Wisconsin was the great home of some of the greatest populism of all time. Fighting Bob La Follette, the progressive, was a hero of mine. Of course, William Jennings Bryan. If you look at the history of the only time a series of progressive amendments have ever been made to the U.S. Constitution, it was populism, the direct election of senators, the income tax, women's right to vote. Yes, it did include prohibition, but that's, that didn't last. But it was a populist movement. But the difficulty here is that you can't call what's going on now as really populism. It's more astroturf. So when we were in the Senate, we would get letters from constituents. And then all of a sudden we would notice that there were like hundreds of the identical letters coming in. You certainly know that. And it got a nickname, astroturf, because it was just manufactured by various special interests. Well, what this populism has become, this right-wing populism, which began actually fairly in a real way with the Tea Party until it was tilted into something else. It started with a concern about the collapse of the economy and was hijacked by the Koch brothers and others into, oh no, we want to reduce taxes. I noticed it at the parades I went to. All of a sudden, they're not talking about reform or corporate domination. They're talking about lowering taxes for rich people. So at that point, I realized that this, quote, populism that people have been hoodwinked into was really just a cover for plutocrats. And if you ever needed proof of that, that inauguration scene with all those moguls there was one of the scariest things I've ever seen. We've seen a lot of scary things.
Just remind us, just for a moment, because I'm sure most people know what you're talking about, but remind us who was in that very front row in the rotunda of the Capitol witnessing the inauguration.
Bezos, Apple guy,
Yeah,
of course, Zuckerberg was there.
Zuckerberg was there.
Who am I missing?
The head of
Elon
Apple.
Musk. Oh yeah, he was there.
Oh,
So, you know, the late 19th century was known as the Gilded Age, when both the economy and potentially the political system was captured by plutocrats. But because of the progressive movement, frankly, partly because of Teddy Roosevelt, who signed the Bob La Follette legislation to prohibit corporate contributions to campaigns, they were able to at least put some limits and put the genie back in the bottle and have a fairly genuine progressive era exist for a while. So for me, it's important to recognize that this is somewhat of a scam to call this populism. It doesn't feel like populism at all to me. It's populism on election day, and then 10 minutes later, it's every fantasy of the very wealthy interests of this country. So that's kind of where I'm at on the populism point. But the point I want to get to at some point is that how did this happen? I mean, that's the most important thing, is how would this happen? How could this flim-flam be perpetrated on the American people? And I realized that it's sort of encapsulated for me in 3 words: my fellow Americans. Remember when presidents used to say, my fellow Americans? In fact, one of the most famous Nixon imitations on Saturday Night Live was my fellow American, like him. But I remember hearing those words, or their similar type, after the assassination of President Kennedy, after 9/11. I always heard those words, and I felt comforted by them, and I felt like that was a real thing, that we were fellow Americans, that we were one people, that we had an American identity. Now, I know that that can be ahistorical, because there's certainly been periods where that's been in question. But that is, to me, how it felt the time while I was growing up. And I think it's been lost. Emil Durkheim wrote that that the country is supposed to have a collective consciousness, which is a shared set of beliefs and sentiments that bind people together. I don't know about you, but I don't think we've got that at all anymore. I don't think this doesn't feel like one nation of people, where we all care about all of us doing well. Of course, you're always going to like your own people better, and you're going to feel more comfortable with people in your own area. But I had this idea that essentially we weren't 2 different teams. It wasn't the Packers versus the Bears. It was actually the idea that we would be together. And I think the loss of that, which I think began with the Tea Party, although I'm not sure the Tea Party intended quite this plutocracy aspect of it, that ever since then, for the last 15 years, and perhaps even longer going back to the 1994 election, that there has been a destruction of the idea of a common American identity. And there are many illustrations of it I could talk about, but it's true in the economy. I think it's true in the attitude toward elections. I think it's true in terms of attitudes about nonviolence in politics, which I could elaborate on. But I feel like until, and I don't know how, but until we can resolve this notion that we're not on different teams, worse than that we're in the middle of a civil war, where the President of the United States is actually saying that we're going to get the Navy to go after the half of the country. This is unprecedented, and I think, almost a prerequisite to solving some of the other problems.
Indeed. You're talking about, this room seems so intimate, I hate to even need a microphone, but you're talking about what has changed about the populist element of what you saw happening with the Tea Party, that did have elements of popular message. I remember the tax propositions of the late 1970s in California and in Wisconsin, and in specific cities and specific counties, and people trying to get some kind of a handle on tax liability. And then that segued into everything else that you've been talking about. Talk about the tax issue for a moment, and then I'd also like to move on to talking about another big pivotal one that I think is particularly salient right now, which is immigration.
Well, in terms of the tax issue, you're right. There's been a tremendous amount of development. As I pointed out earlier, that Tea Party movement was not about taxes. It was about Wall Street. It was about those issues, and then suddenly it was hijacked. And even when there were concerns about, quote, fiscal matters, I don't know if it was tax matters, the effort to pass a constitutional amendment to have a balanced budget amendment went on for many years. Everett Dirksen of Illinois was behind it. They almost got it through the Congress. When he didn't, he went out and tried to call a constitutional convention for the first time in American history to have a balanced budget amendment. And it was only because he died of a heart attack that it didn't get done. But let's be honest about that. That wasn't some crazy right-wing notion. It was conservative. I mean, in Wisconsin, we had a balanced budget amendment in the state legislature. So to me, it wasn't foreign. I didn't support it because I thought that it would be way too constraining for the national government. But it wasn't some extreme idea. It was a conservative idea that's still probably very popular. How that morphed into public policy becoming nothing more than a cover for extreme cuts for taxes for wealthy people, I cannot easily answer. It has to do in part with campaign finance. So what happened was we passed McCain-Feingold after 8 years in early 2001. And we, even though Bush really didn't want to sign the bill, he did it privately, but he signed it. And we got it through the Supreme Court, 5-4. And the main provision of it is still the law of the land, and it was working. But it wasn't until Citizens United actually got rid of the Teddy Roosevelt law from 1907 that you had this open door for a conservative Congress to be pushed and shoved to give enormous tax cuts. And I believe that many people that supported Trump the first time and particularly the second time knew that he was a horrible person to be president, completely inappropriate person to be president, but they love those tax cuts. And they liked the stock market breaking all the records. And they were incredibly to me, overlook everything else. So to me, it was the ability of unlimited money to become dominant in politics that led to this inability to stop reckless tax cuts.
Let's talk about immigration. One of the things that has changed a good deal in the generation since you were in the state legislature and then moved on to Congress, one of the things that has changed, it seems to me, is the salience of the immigration issue. We're a nation of immigrants and so forth, and we've all said that as a mantra all our lives. Many of us have parents, grandparents who spoke another language and who came here, in many cases illegally, who came here just on the promise of America and without any documents. So now to be to this place where it is seemingly at least a candidate to be the most divisive issue in the country, where we have a government shutdown going on right now, and in an attempt to justify it, the president says it's all about illegal aliens. Now, of course, health care for everyone is really the issue. Health care for everyone who's using Obamacare subsidies is actually the issue that seems to be hanging up the shutdown at the moment. But it's easily characterized, even beyond the memes and so forth, it's easily characterized by other more reasonable politicians as being about excessive favoritism towards people who are in this country by whatever means and at whatever degree of legality. So how has that become so virulent?
Well, one of the problems of living a long time is you see the different stages of this. I mean, I grew up in a home where I was a grandson of an immigrant, came over when he was 14 years old and from Russia. And he and my mother's family came from Poland, and I realized if they hadn't been immigrants, I never would have been here. They would have ended up like my great aunts and uncles, who were all executed in the Holocaust. So it's a sensitive subject for many people. But I also have seen the joy of the immigration in this society. I always thought it was a wonderful thing. Never forgot when I was a junior high student in Janesville, they took us to Milwaukee to the folk festival, I think it was called. I never ate so much in my entire life. I wanted the Croatian this and the Serbian this. And I mean, I couldn't believe, and I was fascinated that Wisconsin was one of the great melting pots of people, particularly European, but now much broader. So to me, it was always obviously a great strength, a symbol of America. Didn't see a lot of anti-immigration feeling until there was a movement sort of in, trying to remember the exact time, 2000, sort of in that period, 2005, for English only. You were starting to see this, wait a minute, there's way too much Spanish. We've got to deal with this. And I remember I did a town meeting in every county every year for 18 years.
And that's 72 counties,
20,
by the way.
yeah, 1,200 town meetings.
Yeah.
So these people would start, so I started becoming a little bit of a smart alecky. I said, I maybe you got a point. So what are we going to do about Los Angeles and Las Vegas and San Diego and San Francisco? Are we going to change all those names? I mean, that's Spanish. So I was didn't take it terribly seriously. But it was the beginning of this effort to turn this into a political weapon. And I will say there were Republicans in the Senate that I didn't agree with on anything who were very admirable on this issue. Spencer Abraham of Michigan, Mike DeWine of Ohio. The three of us stopped a very virulent early bill that was particularly harsh even on legal immigrants. But Rubio did some of this. There was, until Trump pulled the plug on it, on Lankford, there was the possibility of real immigration reform. But now it has become so politicized. Obviously, you have to have some rules about illegal people being here. But this insanity of acting as if it's the end of the world, that everything's completely chaotic. I mean, if you go to Wisconsin and you go to a restaurant, it might be a French restaurant, it might be barbecue place. If you go to the restroom and you look in the kitchen, almost everybody in there is Latino. Who's doing the work? Who's doing all that hard work? Who will do it if we terrorize people? In fact, I was recently president of the American Constitution Society, and I listened to our Supreme Court preview yesterday that I didn't do. But one of the cases has to do with the immigration authorities' ability to basically profile people based on where they live or how they look or whether they're speaking Spanish or whether they're doing landscaping or construction. So it has gradually evolved as a political weapon, as did anti-gay sentiments, as did abortion. When you used to cover me way back, abortion wasn't a big issue yet. Anti-gay stuff wasn't a big issue yet. And immigration certainly was not. These are, in my view, largely political developments that have been exploited by those who are plutocrats and are trying to dominate our political system by upsetting people about things that are worth discussing, but not worth destroying people and destroying the unity of our country over.
So do you see a turning point in any of this time in the past that we could address in a sense of looking for the fulcrum, looking for the point either in time or in sentiment shifts on some of these issues where, and I mean people in both parties, because I still maintain the belief that there are Republicans who feel trapped in the current moment in the Senate who would like to be behaving differently, performing differently. And many of these people were there or are still there from your time and are not comfortable with what's going on with the Trump administration, particularly with regard to the issues you've been mentioning and with the shutdown. And they would like a way out. They would like a way to climb down. Is there such a route? Is there such a method?
Well, with one of our political parties, if anybody gets the sense they're looking for a route out or a way out, they'll be out. They'll be booted because it's extremely harsh on that side. Having said that, the one thing I don't understand about, most of them are not my former colleagues because I haven't been in for a long time, is why they care so much about being reelected. Okay, it's great to be a senator, okay? It's, people call you senator, and you get wonderful people taking care of making sure you get where you need to go and write your things for you and so on. But the truth is that after a while, it's sort of like, okay, it's a job, and that all kind of gets old unless you're able to work on something you care about, if you have the freedom to vote as you wish, and if you get to actually do things, why take the job? Unless you're corrupt, you shouldn't get rich doing it. So why do these people are so scared of losing? I'll tell you, I'm feeling pretty good for a guy who lost. Losing is not the end of the world in politics. If you get into politics, unless your name is Barack Obama, you can be pretty sure you're going to lose someday. That's the way it is. That's the nature of the beast. But these people will do anything. They will kowtow to Donald Trump, except for the few, of course, who stood up to him and then quit before the election. I mean, I think Liz Cheney is an absolute hero. And I never agreed with her on anything. But, I mean, what she did, given her reputation, her family, was an example of real courage. So, how do we get people to cooperate with each other? Well, I was reminded yesterday of a book I read just about 2 years ago called American Midnight. Do you know who Adam Hochschild is? He wrote my favorite book, which is King Leopold's Ghost, which is the story of what happened in the Congo under the Belgians and the horrors there. But he wrote a book about the years between 1917 and 1921 in America. If you read this thing, it feels like what's happening now. Anti-immigration, incredible. Anti-labor, brutal law enforcement stuff. Horrible racism, anti-Semitism, the whole gamut, except for one thing. The President of the United States wasn't leading the charge. That's what's different about this. Somehow we have a president who's bought into the idea of an American midnight, or as he calls it, carnage. And so the point of this book is partly to say, look, the country righted itself. The New Deal, well, right, but look what the country had to first go through. The Depression, but the country righted itself and finally decided it had enough. I am worried that it will have to be something like that before people will start worrying so much about whether they can still be called a congressman, and will come together to try to pass legislation. Of course, the midterm elections will be a critical determinant of whether this process can begin.
Let me throw something out for your reaction. Many Republicans seem to feel that whatever their reservations, or more than reservations, about Donald Trump or about his program or about MAGA or about any of the things that we've been talking about, that it is absolutely necessary for them to stand in solidarity with their Republican colleagues and with their Republican voters, because that's the only way they can keep the Democrats out of power, and the Democrats are out of control. That the Democrats, by the means, by the policies they set in place, and more particularly by the way they treated people who didn't agree with them, by the way they treated people with less education, let us say, that the sense of the haughty, look down on you, Democratic, we know better than you, that became the image of the party, and the Republican Party has been animated against that now for a decade or more, 20 years perhaps. And it's really necessary for them not to bail out, because they might get replaced by one of those people.
Well, that's no excuse for the horrible conduct that's occurring now. But in fairness, I do think that the movement of the Democratic Party and elites to elitism has been part of the problem. This is the way I look at it. When I grew up in Wisconsin, Janesville, the person who might have been at the top of the class or one of the top students, go to Madison. Badger. You didn't go to Harvard or Yale. We all went to Madison. And then often those people who were very successful in school, they came home. They came back to Janesville. Maybe their family already had a program. Maybe they're going to politics. But they came home. That's what I did. I'll tell you, it was a wonderful experience. But most people in our modern era, they go, well, I got to get into one of these schools. Look, I went to Harvard. I was at Oxford. I taught at Stanford. Okay, I got plenty of that elite on me. But my career choice had to do with going home and working with the people that I grew up with. That's not how we come off anymore. So when I was teaching, I thought I was a pretty good teacher, and I would have office hours, right? And the students would come, and they never asked me, about anything about the class, because I don't know if they thought I was a good teacher or not. They said, "How do I become a senator?" Sitting under the palm trees at Stanford, and I would say, "Where are you from?" From Platte, Nebraska. Well, what about going home? Well, I don't know if I wanted to, Okay, that's how you get a reputation. People figured it out in these towns. They'd go to the class, we used to call it sing out, where everybody got their awards. They'd figure out that the people that got all the top awards would leave and they'd never come back. That is who I think we became. One of my colleagues, or one of my fellow students at Oxford, was Michael Sandel, the philosopher. He has written extensively on this question of elitism. And, I am deeply grateful for the education I had at those institutions. But it is a worry that the party has become the symbol of people that do very well, that are on the coasts, and that we, lost the connection to the small. And yes, I went to every single county every year, even the tiniest northern counties, which was my favorite part, because it was beautiful and people were really interesting. I had people telling me that was a huge mistake and waste of my time. And the truth is, it was the best thing I did because I felt like I was actually meeting with the people I was working for. Somehow we've lost that. And I don't know, somehow we have to regain it.
There is a string of counties across Wisconsin from the Mississippi River on the west to about Lake Winnebago. I don't know, is it something like 18? You're familiar with Craig Gilbert, the reporter for the Milwaukee Journal
Yeah,
Sentinel.
it's covered all 5 of my Senate races.
Yeah. And he has done an interesting study showing how this string of counties, and they're contiguous from the Mississippi all the way across almost to Lake Michigan, have voted for the winner. In virtually every presidential election and every Senate election, they voted for Ron Johnson. They voted for Tammy Baldwin, like 2-3 times. Each one of those counties, like without fail, that they are, Bellwether doesn't cover it. They're determinative of these races. And they're all basically rural. Some of them have larger communities than others, and Stevens Point is in there, and a few others. But you know what I'm saying, that they're not Milwaukee, they're not Madison,
Right.
and they're not the far northern counties that you're talking about. It's a band across roughly from the Twin Cities east toward to Lake Winnebago, approximately. And so all of them would have to be considered roughly rural, but all of them would have to be considered bedrock America, would it not? And I think most of them voted for you, and I think you carried those counties.
Originally.
And now,
Not always, not the end.
What's changed? Those counties are places you know.
I have to broaden out a little bit. I think, of course, Craig's analysis is correct with regards to those counties, and that's probably true. But actually, there's been an enormous shift in the way the state operates electorally that goes beyond that is part of the story. So the WOW counties, you know that term? So the rural, these suburban counties around Milwaukee are called the WOW counties because it's Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington, right. Those were always conservative. But the population growth became so enormous that it became the biggest motherlode of votes in the United States, along with the suburbs around Birmingham, Alabama. So that's something that changed over the 30 years. Then there were a lot of cities, middle-sized cities in Wisconsin, that were very pro-labor, just tremendous. Kenosha, Racine, I'm looking at Jeff, Manitowoc, Sheboygan. First time I ran, I won all those. I was very pro-labor. They're all gone. They all changed. Labor was gutted. We passed these trade agreements. I opposed NAFTA. I opposed selling those jobs off. And unfortunately, I was right. And so that we've lost those counties to giant evangelical churches that are on the other side of the interstate where they'll vote 500-2 for Donald Trump. So those counties have become taken away from the economic issues. They've lost their economic base. And so we've lost that. Weirdly enough, we've picked up counties that are sort of west of Madison that used to be Republican-ish, or mostly Greene County, Lafayette County. Why is that? All the old people like us from Dane County are going out there to retire, and they're very liberal. So the state is different. It's still very evenly divided, though. But it is true that those swing counties make a difference. One of the things I thought was really strange was some of those counties near Eau Claire and western Wisconsin, La Crosse. For some reason, even though I lost in 2016, there were 5 counties there that voted Trump Feingold. Now, how you can do that, I don't know. But there's something going on there. It was the only place in the United States where that occurred, where there was actually ticket splitting. And there's something going on there that has to do, I think, with what Craig's writing about. The fact that they can swing.
And that people in those places have felt abandoned in some sense or another, left behind, forgotten.
Hollowed out economically. And I think also completely wrongly, when President Obama was elected, there was a reaction from a lot of people who weren't particularly political that didn't have to do with economics. It had to do with something else.
It had to do something
And
else.
we all know what that is. And it was more virulent in some places than others, but it was pretty clear to me. It wasn't because people were hurting particularly economically in 2016. They had been in 2008 and 2010, but things were not in some kind of dire straits. So that's part of it too.
It is.
The urban-rural split.
Yes, and part of the cultural difference. And another thing, just one last question I want to ask you before I open this up, because I know everyone here has got questions as well. The media. How have the media changed since you first got into politics? And if you can do that in any kind of a brief sort of way, is there a fundamental or a capsule version of the change? Is it that Rupert Murdoch came in and became highly influential by owning several very influential entities in the media? Is it just that, or is there something else that is more fundamental to how the media affects politics?
It's more fundamental. It's plutocratic consolidation. When I ran for the United States Senate, I ran for 5 years. The New York Times made fun of me because I had no chance, and they said it's the longest campaign ever. But I went to every little town in Wisconsin. And in every little town, almost, whether it was Beloit, Wisconsin, or Chippewa Falls, they had their own newspaper, typically conservative. But they had their own editorial board. And if you showed up and they thought you were okay, they might write something good about you. They might even endorse you. Every newspaper had its own until they were, including your former employer, and everybody bought up, and they started prohibiting these papers that they bought. They prohibited them from endorsing people. So this is a form of repression of free speech by plutocratic control. Then, of course, with the rise of the internet and cable and all the divisiveness that led to, that was part of it. But the destruction of independent voices is a huge factor. So recently somebody said, how is the Onion continuing to write what it writes? Well, first of all, because they're from Madison, Wisconsin, which I take great pride in. Secondly, it's because they're independently owned. They're not owned by Jeff Bezos. And when you lose that, it's just like losing other forms of free speech. When people are afraid, when CBS News feels like they have to hire a right-wing person to be their editor, when the Washington Post can't even endorse, we've lost a great deal of our freedom, particularly in the form of journalism.
But what about the other, and I would have to say, not corporate controlled and arguably populist dimension here, which is the enormous effects and influence of social media. People get the news from their friends. They get the news from their chat rooms. They get the news from people who they already agree with in a kind of, oh yeah, well, can you top this? Can you top this sort of way?
Well, it's evolved in a very scary way, and it's often involving misleading and false news. First thing I did after 2016 was do a seminar at Stanford on misleading news and all the things that are contributing to it. I'm still a person who believes that somehow that can be worked out, that in the long run, it's good that people can communicate with each other this way. But the way it's evolved is really quite a catastrophe.
It frightens, I think, a lot of people who are in the practice of politics, not only because of reelection, but just fear of the social media as a kind of mob violence that they have to deal with in the information sphere.
Look what happened with this Charlie Kirk guy, with the guy that killed him, supposedly. He was involved with this sort of thing and decided, well, maybe I'll go out and act on it, which, by the way, was one of the things I wanted to mention. The loss of American identity includes the loss of abhorrence for political violence. I feel that this country has become coarsened toward violence and insensitive to violence in politics. I remember, I always tell this story. I remember going to our high school to pick up my daughter, and some people had the bumper sticker that said, "My son is a Middleton High School honor roll student." And then I came back a couple weeks later, and there was, my son can kick the ass of your honor roll student. I go, what the hell is that? And then I watch kids just really enjoying what they used to call all-star wrestling, which was obviously fake, but total violence. And then you have a guy running for president of the United States who says, hey, see those journalists out there? You could rough them up. Oh, no, don't rough them up. No, go ahead, rough them up. If I shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, I would become more popular. This is a man who became president of the United States, who obviously thinks violence is okay. And a president is supposed to be a moral leader. And I believe that this tendency to legitimize violence, to almost challenge people, especially young people, to be open to violence. It's not just guns, as obviously that's a big deal, but the desire to be violent. And I can't believe what's been swept under the rug, basically, of what happened in Minnesota. I mean, I don't know if I ever would have gone into politics if I thought that me or my daughter or my wife or whatever would open the door and somebody would just do that. That person was apparently politically motivated. So the rise of political violence is something I think we were, of course, incredibly shocked when Kennedy was shot. But I don't think we grew up believing that political violence was a sort of normal or common occurrence in America. And it has become so, and that's incredibly inhibiting on the system.
Indeed. And as I promised, I really do want to hear from as many of you as possible. So if you would just raise your hands, I think that'd probably be the easiest thing. We have a microphone. Thank you, Julie. So we have a couple right here. I believe, yeah, we'll get to you.
So on the topic of plutocrats, one of Trump's big things with this agenda was like sowing distrust in government institutions and even like completely dismantling things like PBS, USAID, and the CFPB. So I guess my question is, in a post-Trump situation, how do, I guess, people who believe in democracy and Democrats rebuild those institutions and make them harder to dismantle in the future?
Well, that's a very important point, and the Supreme Court's going to be taking up this year a number of cases that have to do with the extent to which the president can remove people from independent agencies, so-called independent agencies. They need to become independent and immune from this sort of thing. For example, the fact that there can be, that we have an agency that's supposed to decide about mergers, and the president can just basically infect the process, that has to be changed. Now, it has to be changed legislatively. It may also require, which is almost impossible, constitutional amendment. But you have to do something to insulate these because they have systematically gutted the ability to stand up to this, particularly with his capture of the Supreme Court, who's gone along with so much of this. So I don't think Democrats or progressives should copy the 2025 plan. I mean, don't do exactly what they did. But what people should be prepared for is to do what you just said, is to restore those institutions. They can be repaired. The Voice of America can be reactivated. USAID can be reactivated and can be repaired. And it could happen sooner rather than later. It's going to take time. But we're in a building where you guys are being trained to do exactly that. So you're going to have plenty to do. May you live in interesting times. But it will take legislative action. Those are not permanent changes. They're awful, but they're not permanent.
Thank you for that question. Excellent question. We have another student right here. Oh, and would you tell us your names when you ask a question? Thank you very much. And we'll come back to you because I would like to hear your name too.
My name is Eli Goldstein. Thank you for coming. You were saying about the Democratic Party and struggling with the elitism part. Do you see any Democrats right now that are kind of trying to reverse that trend of elitism in the party? And also on the Republican side, do you see any Republicans consistently that I'm not seeing, like, fighting back secretly or like quietly, that need to speak up more, but like that are at least doing something?
Yeah, I thought I was going to see more of the people doing that when I saw what Liz Cheney did and some of the others. I'm hoping it's coming. I do think some of the Democrat governors across the country are coming off pretty well. Governor of Kentucky, governor of Michigan. I think the governor of Illinois is, I was not sure about him for a while, but man, he is very strong and very Chicago. He may be a billionaire, but he's the real deal, a Chicago guy. He sounds like it. Looks like he could play for the Bears. Governor of Pennsylvania, I don't know as well, but yeah, there are, and Governor of North Carolina. I'm not somebody that says it can't be a senator and so on, but this is a time when people might turn to people who appear to be able to do this. The governor of Kentucky has done marvelously well in a very difficult state. I heard him this morning. I think that would improve the image of the party, these people being prominent.
Other questions? Sir. Conveniently, very near the microphone.
Yeah, Tom Sussman. Senator,
Tom Sussman.
Senator, you've done a great job of diagnosing the disease that infects society and body politic. Can you give us a little more information about your prescription for change? How do we bend the arc of the universe back towards justice and not have to wait for the next presidential election?
Well, the first thing is, I don't know how we get back to this, but when I first ran for the state senate back in Wisconsin, I was about 110 pounds, black hair, and like this, huge, walking around a rural area where nobody knew who the hell I was. But when I noticed, I'd knock on the door, and I'd say, "Hi, I'm Russ Feingold. I grew up in Janesville. I live in Middleton with my family." And if I would say something about Democrat or Republican, they'd basically say, "Thank you very much." Close the door. But if I just sort of hung back and see if they wanted to talk, then they knew I wasn't going to proselytize them, and they would talk. So there was this attitude, which is, we don't really care what political party you are. We want to know what you're going to do when you get in there and whether you're going to work with the other people. So it's up to the people to demand that their government be a cooperative engagement between the parties. And so what I always say to people is, if somebody comes and asks you for their vote, tell them, okay, what are you going to do to work with the other party? And when you do answer it, when they come back 2 years later or 4 years later, whatever it is, say, what did you do? Somehow to get people to take that attitude. Now, I realize there are going to be some people that won't do it because of this team thing. But I think that's part of it. Now, practically speaking, and this isn't a partisan thing, the midterm elections have to change the situation in our country. One side has all the power. Now, it's almost axiomatic that when one side has all the power, people start getting mad. Young people particularly don't like it. It's part of the problem Democrats have had over the years. Don't like it when one side has all the power. So if one house or two houses can be flipped to the Democratic side in this case, it would stop the big, beautiful bill from passing. And then you got another problem, executive orders. And yes, that will take a presidential election. But on January 20th, 2027, I predict that a new Democratic president will be sitting there with a pile of 500 executive orders. And I'm hoping that person won't throw the pens out or act like an ass, you know, but those are executive orders. Of course there's been damage. You know, we can get the Gulf of Mexico back. We can have a Defense Department again. But there are many more. But I think of those two things as would make a very different environment. And there are things to sort of practical things that people can think about, hold on to as they engage in the political process. But in the end, it's going to take a cultural change in this country. Somehow people have to realize that the social media is conning them by putting them in this little tube, and that that we really need each other and should be concerned about each other to be, we'll all be better off. But sounds idealistic, but I don't see how any way out of it. Otherwise, we're just, the loss of this American identity, the sense of common identity, it can't work unless we change that.
Other questions? Here in the front row. Oh, thank you.
Hi, my name is Jim Olsey. I want to start by thanking you for both your service and for spending some time talking with us today. I really appreciate that. My question had to do with the observation that Article 1 of the Constitution seems to have disappeared. I went down to the archives. I wanted to see if it was still there, but the archives is closed, of course, so I couldn't see it. But seriously, when you were a senator, even when Congress was in the same party as the president, it was a force to be reckoned with. And now Congress has become very weak. How did that happen, and how do we get its rightful place back that the founders really intended?
Well, unfortunately, if you go back and look at my speeches from when I was in the Senate and my things I worked on, Article 1 was already very seriously compromised throughout the entire 20th century, particularly with regard to foreign policy. It began especially with regard to somebody I admire, Teddy Roosevelt, who basically took Article 2 and the power of the president and took away they just started saying you don't have to have a declaration of war, and they started doing international treaties without congressional approval. And so there's been this, a lot of people have written about it. I've given speeches on the floor of the Senate about it. It was a whole century where you'd give a speech and say, you know, someday somebody's going to come along who's not as responsible as Richard Nixon or John Kennedy or whatever. And sure enough, you have somebody come in who adopts the notion of a unitary executive as a way to basically turn the Congress into a sideshow. The fact that the president has such control over his House and Senate that they would pass a bill like that, that's not an independent body. So the article has been damaged. The Constitution itself, the first time in my life I ever thought this way, the Constitution has such terrible flaws that I did not realize were subject to this until I saw somebody willing to smash all the norms. The Constitution is based on norms. We believe that you would never deny a president the ability to have a Supreme Court justice confirmed for almost a year. That was a destruction of a norm. It wasn't the law, so to say. So it's almost impossible to amend the Constitution. It's the hardest Constitution in the world to amend. If you want to read about how bad it is, read my book I did with a student of mine called The Constitution in Jeopardy, which talks about how we haven't had any amendment for 50 years, and there are many things that need to be changed. But the right is trying to call a constitutional convention which they can do under the Constitution, which wouldn't look anything like what you and I might want. It would be essentially a return to nullification and state legislatures nullifying federal laws and the like. But you are, of course, correct that Article 1 has been, and the Congress has been greatly diminished.
Another question, yes. I think we can get to this gentleman here in the third row.
Thank you for being here, Senator. I'm an immigrant. I'm an independent. I thought this was a nonpartisan forum, so I have a few questions. You took issue with the fact that the Washington Post is owned by Bezos. Who owns the New York Times? You took issue with the fact that Republicans...
Not being able to endorse.
You also talked about ownership.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Okay. The owner demanded that they not endorse. Yeah. That's what I said.
You also mentioned, implied, that the rise in anti-Semitism, which is awful, is attributed to Trump and this administration. Do you think it's more attributed to him than to Netanyahu? You also acknowledged that this is a country where the popular vote should have some respect. Well, the fact is that more people voted for Trump than Harris. You talked about people kowtowing to Trump. How about the people that kowtowed to Biden in the most egregious cover-up of his condition and did huge damage to the Democratic Party, which I think was an absolute shame. So I just wanted to raise a few contrary issues. Thank you, and I respect your opinions, which are different than mine on certain issues.
Well, I respect yours as well, and with regard to the last piece, there's no question that, as they say, mistakes were made with regard to the Biden situation. I will say this, though, because it's not popular. I think Joe Biden's being treated somewhat unfairly. He's a very decent human being. I served with him for many years. Even when I, as a young whippersnapper, defeated him on the Foreign Relations Committee, he never took it out on me. He, I think, did some very strong things legislatively, quickly. He actually confirmed more judges than Trump did. Having said that, the issue of his reelection and so on was a disaster for which we'll pay for a long time. But in fairness, it was not handled well, and I think we all know that.
I would like to give opportunity for perhaps one more question, and someone way in the back. How about that? That just in the spirit of fairness.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Parker Lacey. My question is, like, looking into the midterms in 2028, what kind of candidates should the Democrats push? Do you think we should go back to a more populist approach? And if so, how do we get the establishment to start endorsing these candidates like AOC, Bernie Sanders, Zoran Mamdani, people like that?
Well, I am a progressive and a bit of a populist, and I do think it would be a mistake to try to be what Texas Agriculture Commissioner Jim Hightower used to say, the only thing that's in the middle of the road is a dead armadillo, was his expression. You know, I think you have to motivate people. I think you have to motivate young people. I don't think you do it irrationally, but I think the kind of people like AOC and I think the next mayor of New York could be symbols of real hope for a lot of people in this country, for a diverse nation. And so I'm hoping that the ticket, whether at the top or the second or whatever, reflects that. I think one of the mistakes the Democratic Party has made is buying into this plutocratic stuff, supporting NAFTA, supporting these trade agreements over the years, going with the big money. I think you stand up to the big money. You stand up to the special interest, and you stand up to the plutocrats. And that would be the direction I would want to go. And I want to read one quote.
Please do.
All right. That's the last question I get.
It's the last question. I just have one other thing, and I'll let you close with your quote, but I do want to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about the Campaign for Nature.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Please.
So here's something positive, I think. after the election, of course, people were besides themselves, and I had to tell my staff, the American Constitution Society, you know, the first thing is take care of yourself and your family first. Second, don't let these guys completely dominate your life. They want to flood the zone. They want to flood your brain. They want to make it so you can't think straight, and they're pretty good at it. Don't let them do that. Expose yourself to the information, but not be overwhelmed. But third, apparently a rabbi out in California told his congregation, now what you need to do is not become a snail. Don't snail, meaning get in the crouch position. And he says, do what you know. Do what you know how to do, whatever it is. And so I was approached by something called the Campaign for Nature, which is trying to implement the Convention on Biodiversity. That's about the fact that the planet faces a horrible extinction of natural life. It was created at the same time as the Climate Accord. And we're working around the world to get governments, some of them very conservative, some of them like China, some of the others, some of the most conservative countries are united with regard to certain aspects of the nature issue. The planet has agreed to try to preserve 30% of the land and water of the planet by 2030. That's part of a UN convention. And I was just in New York to celebrate it last week, we have ratified something called the High Seas Treaty, which is for the first time in human history, there is a binding treaty. Of course, the United States isn't party yet, but it's a binding treaty now that regulates the oceans. There's no regulation at all. Once you go 200 miles out, there's nothing to protect the oceans from deep sea mining. We got this done in the middle of all this. And what I hope it does is cause us to create relationships. I had breakfast in New York with former Egyptian ambassador, diplomat Musa, who was one of the great Egyptian politicians, the leading advocate for the Palestinians for 50 years. I am Jewish and very pro-Israel. We had a conversation about that. But what were we united on? This issue of nature. And Egypt has played a role in this. So I think it helps create relationships that can help develop an international commitment to try to turn back authoritarianism. But it has to begin at home. And so I just want to read a quote from George Saunders, who wrote Lincoln in the Bardo, which got the Booker Prize. And he wrote this in May when they were messing around with the Library of Congress. He said, when a ship is sinking, there's value in knowing how fast and calling it out. When a country is self-sabotaging, ditto. So let me just say it. Shame on the White House. Shame on those who should be stopping this slide into autocracy and art and are not. Shame on all of us if we let these ignorant purveyors of cruelty reduce the beautiful thing we built over the hundreds of years to a hollow, braying anti-version of itself. I thought that really captured what we're going through. So thank you for letting me read it.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you to all of you. On behalf of CCPS and American University, Senator, we want to thank you for being with us tonight, and we hope we can get you back to AU and back to Washington at some future point. And we look forward to having our paths cross again. Thank you.